This was quite an unusual project in that it was a local authority and there was a commercial opportunity to buy part of their supply chain. And it was something that had never been done before, to our knowledge. The outcome on this one was actually success for the local authority. Despite being the lowest financial bidder, which we found out a few months later, they were actually successful in winning and taking that business in. 2 years later, actually has been a seamless integration and has worked for both parties. For the local authority, they've got much greater economies of scale in some of what they're doing. For the seller, they've increased the work that they're doing in their other areas with the local authority. I think everyone's looking at this now saying commercially, this was very, very successful. It also represented excellent value for taxpayers' money because actually the payback occurred within 14 months, which was way beyond our expectations, and that's down to the quality of what actually happened once the transaction had taken place. There were a few things that caused us issues. Firstly, there's a political dynamic in this. You're dealing with a local authority. The people we were dealing with are the employed staff, but they answer to elected members. Because this had never been done before, there was certainly a hesitancy to take it forward, and a considerable amount of work had to be done internally to sell this project to the local authority's management team. Another part of the problem was because it had never been done before and we were dealing with a public sector body using public money, they could only ever put in a bid that was based on net asset value. There was no flexibility. There was one fixed number they could go with, that was it. And we'd already identified that the seller was going out to the open market to sell to anyone that was interested in buying the business. It was almost certain that the local authority would be the lowest bidder, and there was nothing they could do about that. They had no flexibility to increase the bid because they got a competitive advantage by taking a competitor in the marketplace. So those were the two key challenges. And finally, you had the situation, absolutely nobody in the local authority had ever done anything like this before. It was completely new to all of them. So we were starting very much from a blank sheet of paper. But it was a very strong commercial case to make this work. We had to structure this in a number of different ways at different stages, and we knew we were in this for the long haul. It was going to be 6 to 12 months to actually complete this transaction. The first thing we had to do was to prepare the management team that we were working with to present to the executive management of the local authority and put forward the case. Simultaneously, there had to be conversations with the seller. In this situation, the seller was a long-term contractor with the local authority. They had known each other for 20 years, but it was commercially right for him to sell that part of what was now non-core to his business. What we also had to start looking at was how we were going to address the elephant in the room, which was they were always going to be the lowest bidder. And what we started to look at was to get them to focus not on the financial value of this transaction, but on the emotional benefit. And the seller was independently wealthy of his own right. This was not about him raising pension money. This wasn't about actually fulfilling any personal need. This was a commercial decision he was taking because other parts of his business needed cash to invest, and he saw this as non-core. But there were an enormous amount of emotional triggers that we could look at in terms of how the staff that were moving with the business would be treated, the reputation in the area, because he was still going to trade with the local authority after this transaction with some of the other business aspects. So we had to go through a process of upselling it to the executive management, but at the same time preparing everyone on the buying team how they could actually put a bid to the seller that was based on emotion, not on finance. And again, we had to prepare us for people who had never done any of this before. A lot of what we were doing was completely alien to them. I think the most important thing we did was to move people away from the idea that all transactions are financially based. Once we started to get the local authority management team to realize that the seller was going to work on an emotional basis. Yes, there was going to be a bottom number they had to achieve. But once we knew that, we knew we couldn't up the bid. So what we had to do was really get them to focus on the fact that in this transaction, it was very much emotion that was tied in. And that was the technique we had to build, that everything had to have an emotional content, not talk about the logical numbers, because they couldn't do anything with that and they were always going to be the weakest. And we actually got that to work very, very well. And it actually became, for the lead person within the local authority, he actually moved into a different level and found this really liberating for him, because he assumed it was all going to be numbers. And the reality was, actually what he found was somebody he'd known for 20 years, it was just a series of really important conversations they went through to get to the very root of what did the seller want from this. It wasn't just money. And the reality is, the money was a certain amount that needed to be reached, because that's the money he needed to invest in the other part of the business. But beyond that, actually the money was irrelevant. It was how the staff would be treated, how his long-term reputation would be. And that was the big thing that we managed to move across with.